Castrati singers in Rome in the 1600s were known for having angelic high voices that were similar to sopranos. They were often the most famous in the chorus. Castrati male singers had beautiful voices, but they got their name by being castrated before puberty, which was a disturbing ritual. The young men who were picked were never even sexually mature. In the middle of the 1600s, when the Pope banned women from singing in public, opera seemed to be in danger. Young boys filled in for a while, but when they hit puberty, their sounds naturally dropped. The Romans changed people's bodies to fix this supposed problem. In their wake, these Italian singers left behind a dark legacy. Adults stuck in bodies of pre-teens. Even though there are no longer any castrati singers, the troubling story of how they got started and how late the practice was still used lives on. Castrated boys replaced female singers. Throughout the course of history, virtuoso singing has been lauded, particularly by Romans during the Renaissance that took place. A significant characteristic of the emerging art form that would eventually develop into opera was the presence of female vocalists who were able to hit notes at high registers. During this period of time in history, however, the Catholic Church prohibited women from singing in any religious context. During the year 1588, Pope Sixtus V furthered the prohibition on female singers by imposing restrictions that prohibited women from performing on any kind of stage. Due to the fact that sopranos were particularly important to the art form, this presented a significant challenge for the world of music. Young male singers were capable of striking the same notes as adult female sopranos, yet, as they approached manhood, their voices would shatter and go lower since they were still immature. In response to this apparent issue, man altered nature by means of a deviant technique that involved castrating young boys at precisely the right time in order to stunt their vocal cords and capture their high youthful voices. Both men and women desired castrati sexually. The assertion that Rome forces every man to become a pederast was made by Casanova at one point. Never before had this been more accurate than it was in the case of the castrati. In the memoirs that he wrote, he described an orgy that took place in which women and castrati were forced to stand in a line, and attendants were required to distinguish between the males and the females. Castrati were biological males who gave the impression of being female and frequently behaved in those manners. They lived outside the boundaries of normal gender, much to the sexual perplexity of those around them. Castrati, who were perceived as neither female nor male, were a sexual temptation for both men and women who dreamt about alternative ways to achieve pleasure. Castrati people lived outside the scope of normal gender. The reputations of castrato singers were, in point of fact, eternally scandalous, and the sexual exploits that they engaged in may be comparable to those of celebrities in the present year. A castrato's body developed abnormally. The lack of testosterone in a castrato's body prevented his bone joints from hardening in the regular manner over the course of his growing body. In several cases, the limbs of a castrato grew to an abnormally lengthy length, giving them the appearance of being seraphic. They were able to achieve unmatched lung power, breath capacity, and huge chests as a result of this aberration, which enabled them to undergo extensive vocal training. Their vocals were also highly flexible and considerably different from the sound of an adult female. This was due to the fact that they sang through vocal cords that were the size of a kid. However, despite the fact that the castrato was considered to have a beautiful appearance, the consequences of the surgery were frequently experienced later in life. This was the case when the patient's massive bones developed osteoporosis and their organs began to struggle under the weight of their abnormally tall bodies. As they became older, many castrati had tremendous emotional anguish and sensitivity, in addition to an unstable mental condition. Depression was also a regular occurrence among castrati. Research conducted on castrati bones reveals that a significant number of the singers got hyperptosis frontalis interna, which is a mysterious condition. This uncommon condition manifests itself when the front bone of the skull becomes thicker. It is characterized by seizures and migraines, and it also affects the sex glands. Women had affairs with female passing castrati. Unusually, English ladies had a strong affection for the Italian castrati, who were easily able to pass for women. Women who were connected with castrati would invite them to parties while pretending to be women, and they would engage in sexual encounters with them despite the fact that their husbands were surrounding them and watching. There were times when the young men were granted a special legal dispensation, despite the fact that the church typically forbade them from getting married. There were even those who turned to sex work in order to supplement their income, and they worked with both male and female customers. They were known to be divas. Not only were castrati notorious for their sensuality, but they were also notorious for their temper outbursts, intolerable vanity, and temper tantrums. They frequently engaged in catty infighting with other artists and friends, which brought in the perception that they were extremely emotional and excessive. They were trained to perform on stage, which included all of the drama and mercurial temperament that comes with it. However, despite the fact that a large number of young boys were exposed to this form of castration, only a small percentage of them were genuinely successful in the vocations that they were assigned. These selected few enjoyed a lavish lifestyle, traveling to the most prestigious opera halls in Europe, from Madrid to Moscow, commanding exorbitant prices and bringing followers of both sexes to their knees throughout their performances. Castration was painful, dangerous, and done without anesthesia. Castration, as demonstrated by contemporary scientific research, has been shown to inhibit the production of testosterone within the male body, hence enabling the male voice to develop around 63% longer than it was before the process. This natural process also caused the thyroid to thicken over time, which resulted in the development of the characteristic that is now commonly referred to as the Adam's apple. The diameters of the vocal cords of castrati were found to be comparable to those of a female soprano, as demonstrated by autopsies performed on castrati after their deaths. When Italian castrati was common, there was no anesthetic available, therefore the boys were either numbed with ice or pushed into a comatose state by a surgeon's assistant pressing on their carotid artery. This was done in order to ensure that the procedure was successful. The penis and testicles were not actually severed, rather the vas deferens in the scrotum were cut, and the testicles would simply shrink and disappear. This procedure was performed in order to remove the testicles. Not only was the process itself excruciatingly painful, but castration of this kind left people with emotional and physical scars that would last a lifetime. Voluntary castration dates back to the 9th century. In spite of the fact that the Italian castrati are the most well-known representation of voluntary castration, the practice may be traced back to ancient Sumeria when it was employed as a means of enslaving and punishing males. It is thought that eunuch singers, who were identical to those who existed in medieval Rome, existed in the early days of the Byzantine Empire about the year 400 AD. Their activities included singing in choirs and entertaining the general public. They gained popularity in the 9th century and continued to do so until the early 1200s, when they were almost completely eradicated as a result of the sacking of Constantinople while the Crusades were in progress. Prior to the adoption of the technique in Italy some 300 years later, the practice of castrating young boys in order to increase their vocal ranges had virtually disappeared forever. Castration was also performed voluntarily by soldiers in Imperial China, but it was not done for the purpose of removing vocal cords. Soldiers in China during the 17th century were castrated and given the task of serving the emperor before they were required to sign up for military service. The most famous castrato sang until 1922. Alessandro Moreschi, who was known as the very last of his kind and sometimes referred to as the Angel of Rome, was a castrato who performed until the year 1922, when he passed away. In spite of the fact that he had been prohibited from performing for a number of years prior, he underwent castration in the year 1865 and went on to have a distinguished career. Although he retired in 1913, he did not stop recording a castrato singer until he made the very first and only recording of one. However, because to the distinctive vocal style that Moreschi possesses, it is highly improbable that he sang in the same manner as the traditional castrato singers of the past. They had little independence and often died alone. Castratis were never given the option to choose to be immortalized as castratis, and the vocal skill sets that were assigned to them restricted the activities that they could engage in for the rest of their lives. The participation of these individuals in the church, the government, or the military was strictly prohibited, and they were not permitted to have any families of their own true existence. In addition to nothing else, they were entertainment for the general public. However, some individuals were unable to achieve success in the field of opera and consequently turned to sex work or singing in the streets for change in order to provide for themselves. Even though there were a lot of people who admired the castrati, there were also a lot of people who thought them to be revolting, and both their admiration and public ridicule were very mixed together. There were a significant number of castrati who suffered from despair or even committed suicide. These individuals are frequently referred to as geldings, nature's rejects, or capons. Forced castrations was finally banned in the early 19th century. However, Italian surgeons continued to manufacture castrati until 1870 for respected performances in the Sistine Chapel, despite the fact that the invasive practice of castration in the name of art was forbidden in the early 19th century. Given that castrato singers had captivated Italy and the Catholic Church for the preceding 300 years, it was difficult to break the so-called habit of listening to them repeatedly. Parents of young male singers were becoming less comfortable with the idea of castrating their kids, despite the fact that the castrati were among the most popular performers among audiences. At the end of the 1700s, Italian families were beginning to pull themselves out of poverty, and they did not feel the need to submit their children to schemes that would make them money. The practice of forcible castration was also met with opposition by intellectuals, many of whom considered that it was an unnatural procedure. This move was also helped along by an intensified effort to bring women back into the theatre. Young boys were not interested in becoming castrati, and at the same time the Pope was obliged to abolish the practice in 1903 due to a lack of subjects and mounting moral outrage.